Why did the room suddenly fall silent when she stepped through the doorway? And why did every pair of canine eyes turn toward her, as if they had been waiting all along? The men in the room still didn't know who she really was. To them, she was a small, quiet janitor who emptied bins, mopped floors, and blended into the background so completely that most of them barely remembered her face. They had walked past her for months without a second thought. Invisible, unimportant, someone whose presence didn't matter. But the dogs noticed. They always had. And today, their silence meant something no one else could understand. The 12 military dogs lay in a perfect circle around the flag-draped casket. No handler could move them. No command could break them. Every instruction fell flat, swallowed by the stillness of the room. The air hummed with tension, as if grief itself had weight. Yet the woman near the door, the one clutching the mop handle a little too tightly, didn't move closer. She didn't speak. She simply watched, her gaze fixed on the coffin she had never been allowed to approach, on the man inside she had not yet been permitted to mourn. Her husband. She lowered her eyes, just as she had done every day for 3 months. The others saw a timid worker. But beneath that silence lived a storm she had forced herself to bury. And there was something she hadn't told them. Not yet. Because this was not the moment to reveal who she was, or what she knew, or why every one of those dogs had refused to obey a single human voice, except the one that hadn't spoken. Her own. She swallowed the ache in her chest, turned toward the door and walked away as if she were no one. But the lead dog lifted its head as she passed. His tail moved once. Only once. And if anyone in the room had truly been paying attention, they would have realized that nothing about this moment was coincidence. Not the silence. Not the dogs. Not her. And definitely not the reason they were waiting. Why did the smallest dog lift her head when the janitor passed the window, as if she recognized a soul she hadn't seen since the day everything went wrong? Amber moved through the hallway in quiet steps, her shoulders tense beneath the weight of grief she refused to show. She had become so good at disappearing that even she sometimes forgot what it felt like to be seen. Every corridor she walked, every doorway she paused beside, every shadow she lingered in, all of it was intentional. 3 months of silence. 3 months of restraint. 3 months of listening instead of speaking. She had watched them call her husband a hero while whispering other things behind closed doors. She had seen eyes avoid hers. She had heard the details they chose not to include in the official report. And every lie carved deeper into the part of her that still loved him. But grief was not the only thing inside her. There was doubt, suspicion, and a truth she was still afraid to say aloud. Because Caleb had never feared the enemy. He feared betrayal. And he had told her quietly, in a tone meant only for her, that if something ever happened to him, it wouldn't be a stranger who pulled the trigger. So while everyone else believed this memorial was an ending, for Amber it was the beginning. Inside the kennel hall, voices rose again, frustration, orders, arguments, none of them understanding that the animals were not resisting command. They were protecting something sacred. They were waiting for someone who mattered. Someone who shared their grief. Someone who shared Caleb's heart. Amber had spent so long pretending she was nothing more than a cleaner that even those who questioned her presence eventually dismissed her. A harmless woman with tired eyes. A worker too small to be a threat. Too quiet to carry a secret. They were wrong. But she wasn't angry about their dismissal. She needed it. Because invisibility was not a burden. It was a shield. And behind it, she was closer to the truth than anyone suspected. There was something she carried, something heavy, unspoken, and every step she took away from the casket was not retreat. It was preparation. For the moment, she would no longer walk away. Why did the Admiral stop at the window and stare at the woman pushing a cleaning cart, as if a part of her already knew the answer everyone else was afraid to consider? The room had thinned, fewer voices now, fewer arguments, only the weight of unresolved tension and 12 silent guardians who refused to move. Their stillness wasn't defiance. It wasn't stubbornness. It was loyalty. Loyalty that ran deeper than training, deeper than protocol, deeper than grief. Amber stood outside, watching through the glass, her breath steady but fragile, as if every inhale risked shattering the careful composure she had built to survive. The Admiral studied the circle of dogs, then turned her gaze outward, to the woman no one truly saw. A woman who had been here every day. Quiet, disciplined, present, and yet unaccounted for. There was something in the Admiral's eyes, not accusation, not suspicion, but understanding, a subtle recognition that the dogs were not waiting for their handler. They were waiting for the only other person whose voice lived inside them, the one who trained beside him, the one who shared their trust, the one who shared their loss. Amber paused outside the door, one hand resting against the wall, grounding herself before she stepped inside. For months, she had fought the urge to reveal what she knew. She had swallowed the truth because grief was already hard enough to survive. But today, the silence of the dogs broke something inside her heart. Because they weren't refusing the world. They were protecting her chance to say goodbye. And they would not move until she did. A quiet breath left her lips. Not from fear. From acceptance. It was time. Time to stop hiding. Time to step into the grief she had been running from. Time to let the world see the woman she truly was, not a janitor. Not a ghost. Not a shadow in the hallway. But the partner Caleb had trusted with his life. And the one who would carry his truth forward. Why did Phantom rise the moment she entered the room, not as a dog responding to command, but as a friend who recognized the person he had been waiting for all along? The silence that followed was not empty. It was full. Full of memory. Full of recognition. Full of love that refused to fade. Amber stopped just inside the doorway. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She didn't need to. The dogs did. Phantom broke the circle first, not abruptly, not aggressively, but gently, as if even movement could disturb the fragile quiet of the moment. He stepped toward her with slow, deliberate certainty. Every paw step carried grief. Every breath carried devotion. He sat at her feet. The room seemed to exhale. And for the first time since the casket arrived, Amber allowed herself to breathe. Her knees weakened. Her hands trembled. And when she finally fell to the floor and wrapped her arms around his neck, it wasn't dramatic or loud. It was quiet, private, human. Her shoulders shook, not with rage, but with the grief she had delayed for months so she could survive long enough to find answers. The other dogs gathered close, not like soldiers returning to formation, but like family drawing nearer to the one person who understood their loss. No words were spoken. None were needed. Amber had lived 3 months in silence, protecting herself, protecting the truth, but there was still something buried inside her that she had not said. Something that lingered between love and regret. Because grief is rarely loud. Sometimes it is quiet. Sometimes it sits beside you. Sometimes it waits. Like they had waited. And in that stillness, Amber understood what she had been afraid to face. Goodbye was no longer someday. It was now. Why had she delayed saying farewell to the man she loved? And why did finally touching the casket feel less like an ending and more like a promise she wasn't ready to break. Her palm rested on the folded flag. Warm, heavy, final. She closed her eyes. For a long moment she said nothing, not to those in the room, not to the admiral, not to the dogs. Only to him. The man who had taught her that strength did not always speak loudly. Sometimes strength meant patience, restraint, quiet endurance. Caleb had believed that loyalty was not obedience, but choice, a choice built on trust, on compassion, on love. The same love that now held 12 dogs in place around the man they refused to abandon. Her voice, when it finally came, was soft, not a command, not authority, but something gentler. Permission, a release. One by one, the dogs said goodbye. Not with ceremony, not with rehearsal, but with quiet gestures that carried more meaning than words ever could. A bowed head, a brief press of fur to cloth, a lingering breath. And when the last one stepped back, the circle opened, and Amber felt something loosen inside her chest. Not because grief was gone. Grief never leaves. But because she no longer carried it alone. The vigil was over. The love was. Why did she walk away not lighter, but clearer, as if grief had given shape to something stronger than sorrow? When the room emptied, she stood alone beside the casket. No music, no speeches, no audience, just silence. And in that silence, a quiet truth rose to the surface. Loyalty wasn't loud. It didn't demand recognition. It didn't shout its worth. It simply stayed. Even when it hurt. Even when the world moved on. Even when goodbye felt impossible. She rested her hand over her heart. Not to hold herself together, but to honor what she knew deep inside. Caleb's life was not measured in medals, nor missions, nor records. It was measured here, in devotion freely given, in trust that did not need permission to exist, in 12 hearts that refused to leave his side until she was ready to say farewell. Sometimes dignity doesn't shout. Sometimes it doesn't plead. Sometimes it doesn't beg to be seen. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. Why did everyone at the briefing table stop talking when she entered? And why did the one man who had doubted her the most suddenly look away, as if he sensed there was something about her he wasn't ready to understand? She stepped inside quietly, the way she always did, small steps, careful posture, not drawing attention, never challenging the space she was allowed to occupy. The mop bucket rattled softly beside her, its wheels echoing against the polished floor. No one should have noticed that sound, not in a room filled with ranks and medals and urgency. But today they did. Or maybe what they noticed wasn't the sound at all. Maybe it was the shift in the room's atmosphere, the subtle tension that rose the instant she crossed the threshold. Conversations faltered, eyes hardened. The same men who had ignored her presence for months now seemed strangely aware of it. Because something about the dogs had changed when she returned. Not visibly, not dramatically, but enough that the men closest to the casket took a half step back without knowing why. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was watchful. Amber lowered her gaze, her expression controlled, her breathing calm. She appeared the same as always, quiet, submissive, apologetic for existing where important things were happening. But inside, something ached against the restraint she'd lived under for so long. She didn't belong here, not as a cleaner, and not yet as who she truly was. Not until she was ready to carry the cost of being seen. Brick's voice broke through the stillness, sharp, frustrated, defensive. "Didn't I tell you to stay out of this building?" His tone made the others tense, But Amber didn't flinch. She nodded, as if absorbing blame she didn't deserve, as if it was easier to accept anger than expose the truth beneath it. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I'll leave." No emotion, no challenge, just compliance. But as she turned away, Phantom rose. Not all the way. Just enough. A small shift of muscle. A breath caught in the back of his throat. His ears lifted, his attention fixed on her like a compass finding north. No handler's call. No command. No instinct. Recognition. It rippled across the circle, not movement, not sound, only awareness. A connection unseen, but deeply felt. Dr. Hazel noticed first. Her brows knitted. Her eyes tracked the subtle synchronization of posture, the silent exchange between the woman walking away and the dogs who refused to break their vigil. She didn't speak. Not yet. Because she sensed something sacred unfolding in front of her, and sacred things were not meant to be interrupted. Amber paused at the doorway. Only for a heartbeat. Only long enough to steady the part of herself that wanted desperately to go back. To cross the invisible line she had stayed behind for 3 agonizing months. To kneel beside the casket she had not touched. To say goodbye to the man she still wasn't allowed to grieve out loud. But grief, she had learned, is patient. It waits in the quiet spaces between movement and memory. And right now, she needed to remain unseen. So she exhaled slowly and stepped into the hallway, letting the door fall shut behind her. The men inside thought she had left because of fear. They were wrong. She left because she wasn't ready to shatter. Not yet. Outside, the corridor felt colder, sharper, as if grief traveled through metal and air the same way sound did. Amber leaned lightly against the wall, her fingers tightening around the mop handle until her knuckles whitened. She closed her eyes and let the ache wash through her in silent waves. Ignored. Dismissed. Invisible. Those feelings weren't new. They had simply become heavier today. And beneath all of them, another emotion lingered. Something quieter. Something dangerous. Determination. She had promised herself she wouldn't break, not until she found the truth buried beneath folded flags and official language. Not until she understood why Caleb's last message to her had sounded less like love and more like warning. Inside the room, the argument resumed, louder now, more frantic, because time was running out and command expected resolution, not reverence. Sedate them. Move them. Clear the space. Proceed as planned. But no one, not even the men giving orders, could shake the feeling that these dogs were not resisting out of stubbornness. They were guarding something. Protecting someone. Waiting. For who? For what? The answer trembled in the air, like a breath waiting to be spoken. Dr. Hazel watched the circle, their posture, their breathing, their unwavering focus, and something in her heart softened. It wasn't science. It wasn't protocol. It was quiet understanding. "They aren't confused," she murmured under her breath. "They're grieving. Not just for their handler, but for the voice missing from the room. The one they trusted second. The one who had never given them a reason to doubt." Amber walked along the outside wall of the building, staying within the narrow strip of shade where sunlight didn't quite reach. Not hiding, just existing in the unseen margins where she'd lived since the day the plane brought Caleb home in a flag and silence. Her footsteps were careful. Measured. Not hesitant, intentional. The way someone moves when they've spent years learning to survive in places where sound can get you killed. She reached the window again and stopped, far enough back not to be noticed, close enough to study every face inside. Brick. Cyrus. Silas. Fletcher. And the dogs. Her dogs, their grief existed without sound, without ceremony, and it struck her in the chest harder than any word could. They weren't just stationed here. They were mourning here. Because loyalty doesn't end when a heartbeat does. It lingers. It waits. It refuses to leave the ones it loves behind. Amber pressed her palm lightly against the cold glass. Not to call them, not to signal, just to be near them for a moment longer than the world believed she deserved. Phantom lifted his head again. Only slightly. Almost imperceptibly. But this time, Hazel saw the full exchange. Her breath stilled. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't curiosity. This wasn't animal instinct searching for novelty. This was memory. This was bond. This was devotion recognizing its counterpart across distance and silence. And Hazel finally understood. They weren't waiting for permission to leave. They were waiting for closure. But closure belonged to only one person. The one who had trained beside them. The one who had spoken to them like living beings, not tools. The one who had loved them alongside the man they had lost. Amber, the woman no one in the room believed mattered, was the only person who did. And still she didn't enter. Because grief, like loyalty, has its own timing. And hers had not yet reached the moment it was brave enough to break. She drew a slow breath, let it tremble, then turned away once more. Not to run, not to escape, but to gather every fragile piece of herself that had been barely holding together since the moment the world told her Caleb died. She needed strength for what was coming, strength for the truth that still waited in shadows, strength for the moment when silence would no longer protect her. Because the dogs weren't the only ones who refused to walk away too soon. Amber wasn't done. With grief, with love, or with the promise she had made the night she learned he would never come home the same way he left. She would not leave him either. Not until the truth did. Why did the Admiral pause before stepping inside, as if she sensed the truth was already in the room, hidden in plain sight, sitting silently among the shadows everyone else had overlooked? The convoy had arrived with ceremony, polished boots, crisp salutes, the weight of authority carried in every movement. Orders were expected. Solutions were demanded. Time was running out. But the moment Admiral Fiona crossed the threshold and saw the circle of dogs, she didn't rush. She stopped. She studied. She listened to the silence. It wasn't the silence of disobedience. It was the silence of devotion. Each dog sat perfectly still, their breathing calm, their posture steady, not tense, not aggressive. There was something else in their eyes, not confusion. Purpose. The Admiral circled slowly, her heels echoing lightly against the floor. No one spoke. Even Brick, firm, stubborn, unyielding Brick, found himself quiet under the weight of what he didn't yet understand. She paused beside Phantom. He did not growl. He did not avert his gaze. He simply watched her with a depth that felt almost human. These aren't just assets, she murmured, more to herself than to the room. They're waiting. Brick shifted uneasily. For what? He asked, his voice edged with impatience, but there was something else beneath it now, something like doubt, something like humility beginning to take shape where certainty had lived before. The Admiral didn't answer. Not yet. Instead, she turned toward the window, toward the world outside the walls, scanning the courtyard, the paths, the distant buildings. Her gaze swept across uniformed personnel, maintenance workers, vehicles, contractors, shadows. Then she saw her. A small figure pushing a cleaning cart, head lowered, body unassuming, posture humble. No presence. No threat. No significance. At least to anyone else. The Admiral's eyes lingered. not because of who Amber appeared to be, but because of how the dogs reacted whenever she was near. A flicker, a shift, a thread of recognition that tied the air together. She did not turn from the window when she spoke. "Commander," her voice was steady, but different now, focused, like someone aligning a final piece into place. "I want every civilian contractor file on this base reviewed, starting with janitorial staff." Cyrus hesitated. "Ma'am, do you believe?" "I believe," she replied quietly, "that these dogs are not waiting for a rank. They are waiting for a person." The room said nothing, but Silas felt something lift inside his chest. A memory, a conversation, a single moment Caleb once shared about someone who understood the dogs in a way words could never explain. Someone rare, someone he protected as fiercely as they protected him. Someone he loved. Across the compound, Amber moved with quiet precision, cleaning a table as if time had no meaning, as if this day was just another morning where her presence began and ended without acknowledgement. But her heart was not calm. Not anymore. Every breath felt heavier. Every echo of phantom silence pressed deeper into her ribs. She felt the weight of 3 months holding itself together, and the fragile line she walked between breaking too soon and breaking when she was finally ready. Because grief does not arrive when others expect it to. It waits until the soul is strong enough to face it. Inside the kennel building, the last of the staff were dismissed at the Admiral's order, leaving only a few trusted figures, the ones she believed needed to hear what came next. Silas, Brick, Dr. Hazel, and the 12 dogs, who hadn't moved since the moment the casket arrived. The Admiral's voice lowered, steady but quieter now, as if she, too, understood that some truths were not meant to be spoken loudly. "These dogs belong to a classified unit," she said. Brick straightened. Silas didn't move. Hazel held her breath. "They were trained," Fiona continued, "by 2 people." Silence thickened. Gray light filtered through the window. Phantom's ear twitched. "One was Caleb," she said softly, "their handler, their leader." Her eyes shifted toward the courtyard again. "The other is not in this room." Silas closed his eyes for the briefest second. He knew. He had known. He just hadn't wanted to believe it. Because belief meant accepting everything that followed. Loss, love, betrayal, loneliness lived in disguise. The Admiral nodded toward the door. "Bring her," she said quietly. "It's time." Silas left the building without a word. Not in urgency. Not in authority. But with reverence. Because suddenly, this wasn't about command. It wasn't about protocol. It wasn't even about solving a logistics problem before a memorial. It was about dignity. About grief that had been forced into silence. About a woman who had held her heart together while carrying a truth too painful to say aloud. Amber stood in a dim supply closet, stacking bottles on a shelf, her movements disciplined, controlled, deliberate. Silas didn't say her name. He didn't need to. He only said 4 words. "Phantom is waiting." Her hand stopped. Slowly she turned. The mask fell away, not abruptly, but gently, like a curtain lowering at the end of a performance no one knew they'd been watching. Her eyes weren't submissive anymore. They were steady, haunted, resolute. "Who told you?" she asked. His answer was simple. "The Admiral." A breath left her chest, not fear, not relief, something deeper. Acceptance. The kind that comes after running from grief for as long as the heart can stand. "The dogs," Silas continued, "haven't moved since the casket arrived." Amber closed her eyes, as if those words struck the very center of her being. She nodded. Not for them. For herself. It was time to stop pretending. Time to step into the pain she had been postponing. Time to face the love that refused to let her walk away. She followed him across the courtyard. Every step felt heavier. Every heartbeat louder. The world seemed both painfully real and far away. Those who passed them glanced only briefly. They still saw a janitor. They still saw a nobody. But the dogs saw home. When she stepped through the doorway, the air changed. Softly, naturally, unmistakably. Phantom rose first. Not because he was commanded. Not because he had to. Because grief recognizes its mirror. His body moved toward her, slow, deliberate, like a soldier standing from a final watch. Then Luna. Then Odin. Then Reaper. A chain reaction. Not of obedience. Of belonging. Amber stopped. She didn't speak. She didn't move closer. She simply breathed. The moment held everything at once. Pain. Love. Memory. Silence. Sila's didn't interrupt. Hazel wiped tears from her eyes she didn't try to hide. Even Brick felt something crack inside the armor of authority he wore like habit. Amber's knees weakened. Her hand trembled. Then finally, she knelt. She wrapped her arms around Phantom's neck. Her body shook, not violently, but with the fragile release of someone who had carried grief too long. No sound broke from her. Some heartbreaks live beyond tears. The dogs closed around her like a living shield. Not guarding the casket anymore. Guarding her. Their final duty wasn't to protect the dead. It was to carry the living through the moment she could finally say goodbye. For months she had hidden. She had endured silence. She had accepted dismissal. She had swallowed love so deep inside herself that even breathing hurt. But here, she didn't have to pretend anymore. Not to be invisible. Not to be strong. Not to be unbreakable. She could simply be a wife, a partner, a soul who had lost the one person who understood her without needing words. A quiet truth filled the room, one that needed no explanation. The dogs had never been guarding the casket. They had been guarding grief. Until she was ready to face it. And now, she was. Why did silence feel heavier now? As if the room itself understood that grief had shifted, no longer something distant, but something alive, breathing, trembling quietly in the space between memory and farewell. Amber stayed on the floor for a long while, not speaking, not rushing, not trying to control the moment the way she had controlled every emotion for the past 3 months. Her face rested gently against Phantom's fur, her hands pressed over his shoulders as if grounding herself to the only living bridge left between her and the man inside the casket. She didn't cry loudly. There were no sobs, no dramatic collapse, just quiet shaking breaths, the kind that come from a wound too deep for sound. The dogs did not move away. They drew closer, not crowding her, supporting her. A silent promise in the way they stood, steady, patient, as if they understood that she had finally reached the moment she had been walking toward since the night everything changed. The Admiral didn't interrupt. Brick didn't command. Hazel didn't whisper clinical observations into the air. Silas didn't speak her name. No one tried to own the moment. No one tried to step into it. Because some moments don't belong to witnesses. They belong to the ones who live the story. Amber lifted her head slowly, her hand trembling as she brushed Phantom's neck one last time before looking toward the casket. Not directly. Not yet. Her gaze only hovered there, like a thought she was still building the courage to face. There was a question in her eyes. A question she had carried since the day they told her what happened. A question she was afraid to ask. And it lingered in the air like unshed tears. Hazel noticed it first. A subtle tightening of Amber's jaw. A flicker of doubt beneath grief. Something unresolved. Something unspoken. Amber, Hazel said gently, her voice soft enough to break tension without shattering the moment. You don't have to say anything. Amber didn't answer. Not right away. She looked at Phantom again, into eyes that had seen more than most humans ever would, and she realized something with startling clarity. The dogs were not simply here to mourn. They were here because they remembered. They remembered moments. Commands. Laughs. Secrets. Decisions. They remembered the truth. Or at least a piece of it. And Amber finally understood why she hadn't been able to say goodbye all this time. It wasn't only grief holding her back. It was doubt. It was fear, not of loss itself, but of the unknown space between what she had been told and what Caleb had hinted before his final mission. Her fingers tightened against Phantom's fur again. Caleb, he called me, she said softly, not looking at anyone, not projecting her voice outward, just speaking into the air like a confession meant for the one person who might still hear it. The night before, his voice didn't sound afraid. It sounded resolved. Silas looked down. He had heard that tone before. Not from Caleb. From others. Before missions that weren't clean. Before decisions that weighed more than orders. Amber drew a slow breath. He said if anything ever happened, it wouldn't be because we failed. She paused. Her chest rose and fell. Her eyes flicked toward the coffin. It would be because someone made a choice. A ripple moved through the room. Not accusation. Not shock. Just heaviness. The kind that lives beneath truth. The Admiral closed her eyes for a moment. Because she had read all the reports. The versions written for files. The versions written for families. The versions that never reached anyone outside secure rooms. And none of them felt whole. Hazel spoke gently, careful not to break the fragile trust breathing in the space between them. Amber, do you believe something was left out? Amber didn't answer immediately. She didn't rush the thought. She had lived with that question too long to spill it carelessly now. Instead, she looked at the dogs. At Luna's stillness. At Odin's lowered head. At Reaper's unblinking stare toward the casket. They weren't restless. They weren't confused. They weren't distressed. They were loyal. Resolute. Unmoved. They weren't guarding the dead. They were witnessing the living. Because grief for them was not doubt. It was devotion. And suddenly Amber felt small again, not because she lacked strength, but because love can make even the strongest heart feel fragile. I wasn't there, she whispered. I don't know what happened. I don't want to blame anyone. I only want the truth. Her voice quivered. Not with anger. With vulnerability. With love that had nowhere else to go. Fiona stepped closer, her tone steady, grounded, compassionate. Then you deserve to hear it, she said quietly. Silas swallowed hard. Brick shifted, his composure cracking in a way he couldn't hide anymore. He wasn't defensive. He looked tired. Haunted. Like someone who had lived with his own unanswered questions. I pushed the team, he admitted, his voice low, not excuse, not justification, just honesty. We were under pressure. The window was closing. I believed we could finish it and get out. He paused. His eyes lifted toward the casket. We didn't. No blame. No names. No heroes. No villains, just reality. Amber listened, not with judgment, but with the slow acceptance of someone finally placing missing pieces where they belonged. Not to accuse, not to punish, just to understand. Silence filled the room again, but it didn't feel cold this time. It felt human, shared, collective, like grief had stopped being hers alone and had become something they carried together. Phantom shifted closer, his head gently pressing against her arm. Not to comfort her, to anchor her, to tell her, "You are not alone here. You never were." Amber turned toward the casket at last. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just finally. Her steps were small, measured, deliberate. The dogs parted for her without command, forming a soft corridor of living presence, not escorting her, accompanying her. Her hand hovered above the flag. Her breath trembled once. Then she touched it. Warm cloth beneath her palm. Weight beneath her fingertips. Truth beneath her heart. The world became very quiet. No speeches. No ceremony. No staged closure. Just a woman and the man she loved. And the space where words no longer mattered. Her voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "I forgive you for leaving me with questions." A pause. Soft. Gentle. "I forgive myself for not being brave enough to face them sooner." She exhaled. Slowly. Carefully. As if exhaling grief itself. The dogs lowered their heads. Not in obedience. In reverence. Brick turned away not out of shame, but to gather himself. Hazel pressed a hand to her chest. Silas closed his eyes. The Admiral bowed her head not as a superior officer, but as a witness to something sacred. Amber leaned closer, her forehead resting lightly against the flag, not clinging, not breaking, just connecting. "I loved you," she whispered. A breath. "I still do." There was no dramatic swell of emotion. No grand closing note. Just peace. Quiet. Deep. Real. And for the first time since the day they brought him home, the weight on her chest loosened. Not gone. Never gone. But lighter. Shared. Carried. Her hand slid away gently. Not as a release. As a promise she would carry forward instead of hiding from. The dogs didn't move yet. They waited. Not for orders. For her. Because grief, like loyalty, moves only when the heart is ready. Amber stood slowly. Not stronger. Not harder. But steadier. More honest. More whole than before. She didn't look powerful. She didn't look heroic. She simply looked human. And in that quiet moment, somewhere deep inside her, hope exhaled for the first time in months. Why did the hallway outside feel different when she stepped away from the casket, as if the world itself had shifted, like grief had rearranged the gravity around her, and nothing would ever sit in the same place again? She didn't rush. She didn't leave the room the way people usually do after farewells, with finality, with closure, with a sense that something had ended. No, her steps were slow, careful, thoughtful, as if every movement carried a memory with it and she didn't want to drop any along the way. Phantom stayed beside her. Not leading. Not following. Just there. Their pace matched without effort, a rhythm they had shared long before uniforms and titles and folded flags. The other dogs formed a quiet path again, but this time their posture had softened. Less guarded, less rigid. The tension in the room had eased, like a storm finally passing and leaving the air washed clean. Amber paused near the far wall. She rested her hand against it, as if she needed something solid to lean into while the rest of her found its balance again. Her breathing steadied, not fully calm, but no longer shattering. Hazel watched her closely, not as a doctor, not as a professional observer, but as another human being who recognized the fragile steadiness that comes after a long, silent battle with your own heart. Brick stood with his hands clasped behind his back, not in command posture but in quiet respect. The hardness in his shoulders had softened. He looked older now, more honest, less certain, and strangely more real. Silas remained still, like a sentry who understood that some moments required presence, not participation. No one spoke, because the room didn't need words. It needed space, time, breath. Amber finally looked toward the Admiral. Not defiant, not pleading, not seeking permission, just acknowledging. "I didn't mean to deceive anyone," she said softly. Her voice was steady, but underneath it lived months of restraint, the kind that shapes itself into careful sentences so emotion doesn't spill out too fast. Fiona shook her head gently. "You didn't deceive us," she replied. "We just never asked who you were." The words landed deeper than expected. They weren't accusation. They were reflection. A quiet admission of how easy it is to overlook the people we don't expect to matter. Amber lowered her gaze briefly. "I wasn't sure I was ready to be her again." Sorry. The woman she used to be. The one who wasn't invisible. The one who wasn't hidden behind uniforms that didn't belong to her and hallways where no one spoke her name. Hazel stepped forward, not intruding, just close enough that Amber could feel support without feeling watched. "You don't have to be anyone you're not," Hazel said gently. Amber gave a small, almost fragile smile. "That's the hard part," she whispered. "I don't know who I am without him." Phantom leaned into her leg, just slightly, as if answering for the both of them. Not alone. Not lost. Just finding ground again. Brick cleared his throat, hesitant, not the commanding voice he used in briefings, but something quieter, less sure, more human. "I didn't see it," he admitted. "Any of this, you, them, what this meant." Amber didn't look at him with anger. There was no bitterness in her expression. Only understanding. "I didn't want to be seen," she replied softly. Silence followed. Not awkward. Not tense. Just thoughtful. Because sometimes it takes loss to realize how many people live quietly in the margins, carrying stories no one notices. Fiona broke the silence gently. "There's something you should know," she said, "about the mission." Amber didn't tense this time. She didn't brace for pain. She simply listened. Ready now. Not for closure. For truth. Fiona's tone shifted, not cold, not official but careful, like someone carrying something fragile in both hands. "The report you received wasn't the full one," she said. Amber nodded slowly. "I thought so." There was no accusation in her voice. Just acceptance, like someone finally hearing a sentence their heart already knew the shape of. "It wasn't a failure," Fiona continued. "They weren't reckless. They didn't misjudge. They stayed behind because someone had to hold the line long enough for civilians to escape." Brick's jaw tightened. Silas blinked hard. Hazel pressed her lips together. Amber closed her eyes, not in grief this time. In relief. In pride. In ache. In love. "He chose to stay," Amber whispered. Fiona nodded. "Yes." Amber exhaled slowly, as if those words rested somewhere deep inside her, and finally, she could lay them down. "He always said the hardest choices," she murmured, "were the ones no one would ever see." A small, painful smile touched her lips. "He never needed credit." Her voice softened further. He just needed to know someone was safe. Phantom shifted closer, his head pressing against her hip again, grounding her, reminding her that love doesn't vanish when a heartbeat stops. It changes. It remains. It finds new places to live. She ran her fingers gently across his fur. "You stayed with him," she whispered. The dog stilled. The room did too. Not because animals understand words the way humans do, but because loyalty speaks a language deeper than speech. Hazel swallowed. Brick looked away. Sela's eyes glossed again. Fiona's gaze lowered in respect. Amber's voice grew softer, a breath more than a sound. "You didn't refuse command," she said to them. "You kept watch until someone he loved could say goodbye." The realization spread through the room like light filling a dark corner. They weren't disobedient. They weren't irrational. They weren't stubborn. They were faithful. Until the very end. Until she was ready. Until grief finally had somewhere to rest. Amber knelt again, not in collapse but in gratitude. One hand on Phantom. Another resting lightly on the floor. "This wasn't about duty," she said quietly. A pause. "It was about dignity." No one argued. Because they all felt it now. The truth. The weight. The meaning. Brick inhaled slowly. Then, for the first time since this began, he spoke not as a commanding officer, but as a man humbled by what he had witnessed. "We don't deserve to lead them," he said softly, glancing toward the dogs, "if we can't understand their hearts." Amber looked up. Her eyes didn't challenge him. They acknowledged him. A moment passed between them, fragile, honest, important. Not resolution. Respect. Sela stepped forward slightly. "Amber," he said gently, "when you're ready, we'd like to make sure his story is told the right way." She didn't answer right away. She took a breath. Then another. Then nodded. Not for them. For Caleb. For herself. For the love that had finally found the courage to stand again. "I don't want a legend," she said softly. Another pause. "I just want the truth remembered." The Admiral nodded. "So do we." No one tried to move the dogs yet. No one rushed the moment. Because grief isn't something you dismiss. It's something you learn how to live alongside. Amber stood slowly. Not stronger. Not healed. But steadier. More whole. More present. She looked around the room one last time, not to say farewell, but to carry it forward. The silence didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt sacred. Like a promise. Like a story that would live, not because someone shouted it, but because those who witnessed it would never forget. Her hand brushed Phantom's head. Her voice soft, almost like a prayer, lingered in the air. "Thank you for staying." The room didn't answer. It didn't need to. Because sometimes, the truest conversations are the ones spoken only in silence. Why did the air outside feel lighter when she finally stepped through the doorway? Not because the pain had disappeared, but because it no longer carried her alone. The afternoon light stretched across the courtyard in thin, gentle lines, painting long shadows across the concrete. The breeze was faint, soft, the kind that barely moved the leaves but somehow felt like a quiet hand on the shoulder, steadying, reassuring, reminding her that the world hadn't stopped even when her heart once felt like it had. Amber didn't hurry. She didn't walk like someone escaping grief. She walked like someone learning how to carry it differently. Phantom moved beside her again, matching her steps, calm now, grounded, no longer guarding a doorway between farewell and silence. The other dogs remained inside a little longer, resting, breathing, existing in the quiet aftermath of something deeply human. Not an ending, a shift, a transition from holding vigil to letting go carefully. Amber paused near a low stone wall and sat, not because she was weak, but because she finally allowed herself to rest. The kind of rest that isn't physical, the kind that happens when your heart stops bracing for impact. Silas lingered near the entrance, close enough to be there, far enough not to intrude. Hazel stood nearby with her arms folded softly, more for comfort than posture. Brick remained inside for a moment longer, his expression unreadable, like someone who had just realized the world was larger than the rules he once believed were absolute. The Admiral joined Amber quietly. No rank, no command, just presence. For a long while no one spoke. Not because they lacked words, because they finally understood when silence mattered more. Amber looked across the courtyard, at the sky, the distant tree line, the open space beyond fences and walls. It didn't feel empty anymore. It felt wide enough to hold memory, wide enough to hold love, wide enough to hold grief without crushing her. She drew in a breath that didn't tremble this time. It simply existed. I used to hate quiet, she said softly. The Admiral glanced at her, not curious, not probing, just listening. Amber smiled faintly. On missions, silence meant something could go wrong at any second. She paused. After he died, silence meant he wasn't coming back. Her eyes softened. But today, it didn't feel like loss. A quiet beat. It felt like presence. Phantom rested his head against her knee, steady, warm, patient. Hazel's voice joined gently. Sometimes silence isn't emptiness, she said. Sometimes it's everything we don't know how to say yet. Amber nodded. Not in agreement. In recognition. Because that was what grief had been all along. Not a wall, but a language she was only now beginning to understand. Brick stepped outside at last. He looked different. Smaller. Not in stature, in certainty. He walked over with steady, hesitant steps, as if approaching something fragile. He stood in front of Amber, not above her, not beside authority, simply as another person who had also been changed by what he witnessed. I owe you an apology, he said quietly. She looked up, not defensive, not guarded. Just open. You don't owe me anything. He shook his head. Yes, he replied, I do. He took a slow breath. I saw disobedience where there was loyalty. I saw a problem where there was grief. His voice softened. And I saw you and assumed you were nobody. The words didn't sting. They didn't reopen wounds. They acknowledged what had always been there. Amber didn't respond with bitterness. She responded with compassion. You saw what you were trained to see, she said gently. Brick lowered his gaze. Maybe, he said, but today I learned what I needed to see instead. He didn't explain further. He didn't justify. He didn't ask forgiveness. He simply let the truth rest where it belonged. Silas approached next, his hands in his pockets, shoulders slightly slouched, like someone who had carried weight for a long time and finally found a place to set it down. You know, he said softly, Caleb used to say something about you. Amber smiled, a soft ache in it, the kind that hurts but doesn't wound. What did he say? Silas looked toward the horizon. He said you were the strongest quiet he'd ever known. Her eyes filled, not with tears that overflowed, but with warmth that stayed where it belonged. She didn't reply. She didn't need to. Because love, even remembered, still breathes. The Admiral turned toward Phantom. What happens to them now, she asked carefully, is your choice too. Amber traced her fingertips through his fur. I don't want them reassigned yet, she said softly. They've carried enough. No one questioned it. No one challenged it. Hazel nodded gently. We'll give them time. Time, the one thing grief doesn't measure. It simply lives alongside it. Amber closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting the last fragile echo of resistance leave her chest. Then she whispered, not to the Admiral, not to Silas, not to anyone standing near her. To herself. To Caleb. To the silence that wasn't empty anymore. I'm going to be okay. Not today. Not tomorrow. But someday. And someday was enough. Phantom lifted his head and looked toward the doorway, toward the others still inside. One by one, they began to move. Not rushed. Not commanded. Natural. As if they knew their watch had shifted, not ended, shifted. They stepped into the light behind her. Not in formation. In unity. The circle was gone now. Not broken. Transformed. Their loyalty had not diminished. It had simply found a new center. Amber stood. Slowly. Deliberately. Not as a soldier. Not as a widow. Not as a figure in someone else's story. As herself. A woman who had loved deeply. Lost deeply. Endured quietly. And emerged not unscarred but unbroken. She looked one last time toward the building, not in longing, but in gratitude. For the love that stayed. For the loyalty that refused to leave. For the goodbye she had finally been brave enough to face. The Admiral placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, not guiding, acknowledging. If you ever need anything, she said softly, you won't have to stand in silence to be seen again. Amber nodded. Not with promise. With trust. The dogs settled around her, not as guardians now, but as companions. No one took a picture. No one made a speech. No one tried to turn the moment into something larger than it already was. Because its power came from what it didn't announce. What it didn't demand. What it didn't need to prove. Amber took one final breath, steady, grounded, quiet. The kind of breath that belongs to someone who is finally ready to move forward, without leaving anything behind. And as they walked together, woman and dogs, grief and dignity, memory and hope, the story didn't end. It simply became something lived, something carried, something remembered. Because sometimes the strongest acts are not loud. They are not seen. They are not spoken. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.